Alright guys, so let's do another interesting video here. This is gonna be interesting. So in 1968 in Puerto Rico, Dr. Kling actually removed a part of the monkey brain known as the amygdala. And this experiment was done both in Puerto Rico but also in Zambia later on. And the monkeys died because they couldn't detect fear, right? The amygdala is part of the brain that's important in emotional processing, problem solving, and fear. So when you remove it from these animals, from these monkeys, they couldn't detect the fear. So the predators would eat them, and they had poor orientation as well. So they couldn't find the prey, and they were hungry, they would starve to death. So they didn't last for very long. There was a client called SM, right? That's how he was called, and he had Urback-Wiethe Syndrome, which means he literally had fat deposits in his brain that caused the amygdala to be damaged or destroyed. And so he had fear of nothing. Nothing made him scared. He didn't have fear of anything. And Dr. Feinstein actually specializes in anxiety. And he studied the relationship, and he saw that overactivation of the amygdala makes people anxious. And he met this client, SM, with the syndrome that had his amygdala destroyed. In 2006, he met with him, and he connected her, the patient, to an inhaled 35% CO2, carbon dioxide, that SM inhaled, and the rest was room air. And she became so anxious and literally had labored breathing, hunched up shoulders, and helped her fear a panic attack. So before she wasn't scared of anything, but this 35% carbon dioxide really made her scared. And that's the reason, because if you have a high amounts of CO2, it's as if you're holding your breath, and your chemoreceptors in your brain are going to trigger you to breathe. And so this shows that there is a universal thing that makes us anxious or paranoid, and it's not even necessarily psychological in nature, but it's just a suffocation when we don't have more air to breathe. And Feinstein actually used it for his patients, and he got promising results simply by giving them carbon dioxide. And that actually made them, people who couldn't sense fear before were finally doing it. And this therapy also had promising results because it helps people have better adaptation to reduce carbon dioxide levels. So they're able to have better flexibility. And Feinstein administered the same dose to the author, who initially felt nothing after his first carbon dioxide hit, because he already had kind of flexed chemoreceptors, unlike those of panic disorders and anxiety. But he later felt like he was choking, his vision got blurry, and he wanted to breathe, but then it stopped eventually, and his anxiety subsided in just a few days. So this effect was only short-lived, where after you're given CO2, yes, you feel anxiety initially, you may feel some other effects, but eventually you get used to it. Initially you feel that choking and suffocation and wanting to breathe, but eventually it becomes better over time, and in fact you get better CO2 tolerance. Now when CO2 levels rise, what happens is you have central chemoreceptors in your brainstem, actually in your medulla oblongata, which signal the brain to tell the lungs or the muscles of the lungs to breathe more and get in more air. The goal of carbon dioxide therapy is to be able to tolerate higher amounts of CO2 and become flexible to it. This can be useful for the 18% of us that have anxiety, right, in the world. So holding the breath can actually raise carbon dioxide levels and help with anxiety by tolerating higher levels of CO2. And breath holding is an ancient practice dating back to pranayama and to the Chinese around 2,000 years ago. But today we link breath holding to disease, which can be the case as in sleep apnea, right, as it can cause high blood pressure, neurological issues, autoimmune conditions, right, epilepsy, whatever. But 80% of office workers have continuous partial attention, which is a state of this erratic breathing when we're distracted. So you're doing it unconsciously, right, rather than what we saw in the previous video when we talked about tumo, which is the conscious kind of overbreathing. In this case, we hold our breath, and we actually, so we vary it, or sometimes we overbreathe and we're unconscious. And this is kind of like what we saw in the Da Costa's Civil War soldiers that were under scare. They also have this irritable heart syndrome where they're unconscious of it. And Feinstein showed that carbon dioxide actually can cause can cause problems, but it can also be a cure for anxiety and paranoia, because over time you build that tolerance, you build that flexibility for higher CO2 levels. And this was also shown in Urback-Wiethe in thermal springs, and even Brandt helped his patients in 1870s. So this was very common in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The CO2 was like a go-to type of treatment, right? And then it literally disappeared until it was rediscovered by Whoop and Donald Kling, unfortunately, who's not alive right now. He died at the age of, I believe, 90. And both of those rediscovered it in the 1950s. And so now most people use SSRIs, right, for depression, but less than 50% actually get the benefits. And other techniques are things like mindful meditation and exposure therapy for anxiety and all that. But we need to be careful using the CO2 technique of people with panic attacks and anxiety, because they're low tolerance, right? They're very low tolerant. But that's the whole point. The idea is to start with lower amounts of CO2 and then gradually increase them so the person increases the tolerance. But you don't want to give them a lot of CO2 in the first time. And then Alicia Murata also showed the benefits of slow breathing and even breath holding to raise carbon dioxide levels and breathe better to reduce shortness of breath and breathlessness, but it can also be used for panic. So this idea of breathing less or giving people or breath holding to increase CO2 levels is good for panic, because people get used to higher CO2 levels. Now the author actually mentioned, therefore, anxiety is not a psychological issue, but it just means that you need to breathe more air. So therefore, the pills that treat anxiety may not be the best, and therefore we now know a physiological mechanism of anxiety, and therefore much more accessible therapies can actually be used to treat anxiety. This is really interesting to how we deal with all of this, rather than taking all of those pills which address the psychological issues. So I found this to be really, really interesting. So yeah, it was rediscovered, and now, as you see, Dr. Feinstein is using it with his clients, etc. Now, the author goes on, and he wants to better understand the practice of yoga, and he goes on to meet De Rose, who speaks Portuguese, and who teaches them about yoga. The author still has no idea how the monks can heat themselves up to double-digit numbers, even when their metabolism goes down by 64%. And there's monks in Rishikesh who can heat themselves up, and a bunch of them too. So how do they do it? The author presents the concept of prana also in one of the chapters. And he knows that it's the life force and what gives us energy. And this was first documented in India and China around 3,000 years ago. So this is an ancient type of practice. And the Chinese actually call it qi, others have different names for it. And in the 1970s, Swami Rama actually did really, really crazy stunts in front of Dr. Elmer Green in Menninger Clinic in Kansas. And he was able to go into a delta sleep, which is a deep sleep state that we get. But his mind was completely awake. And then he was able to control his heart rate, even both lowering it and increasing it, and even stopping it for 30 minutes, which was so crazy. And different yogis before him also did this. In fact, in the 1940s, Georgie, who had the National Foundation of Cancer, described prana, of this energy, as electron transfer, and things are alive because they can transfer electrons. In fact, when oxygen gave aerobic life, recall that was around 2.5 billion years ago, there was more electron transfer because oxygen is a strong electron acceptor, and when electrons stop being transferred to you, you lose this prana, and this loss of energy leads to cancer. And when they stop completely, death results, right? So this energy is what makes us alive. And 5,000 years ago, actually, in the Indus Sarasvati civilization, that's when yoga came to be first into life. And the Aryans came in and took the culture of this civilization and condensed it into these Vedic texts, Vedic teachings, which were synthesized in around 500 BCE into Yogi's Sutras of Patanjali. And the yoga involved asanas where you literally hold your poses for a long time and you focus on your breath, which is different from how we do it right now. We're not still, we're moving when we're doing the yoga. So we're doing kind of like an aerobic dance or an aerobic exercise. But that was different before. When yoga was just invented, people are doing these asanas in a very still position and literally just focusing on the breath. And again, there's no right or wrong way of doing it. But there used to be no movement at all in this Indus-Sarasvati civilization when yoga was first discovered. They were just sitting still. It was designed for everyone to expand their consciousness, and the author actually practiced Kriya, which was discovered 400 BCE, and involves 40 minutes of intensive breathing followed by slow breathing and then hardly breathing at all. And these pranayama techniques, right, some more vigorous than others, were practiced for thousands of years to spread this energy throughout the body. And the key is to be patient and not go overboard. But all of these techniques, right, what the Chinese practiced 3,000 years ago, this pranayama, right, all of these types of techniques, right, holotropic breathing, Buteyko breathing, have something in common, right? They help us balance the mind and the body a lot better. They improve our sleep, they improve our performance, they help us live longer. They improve heart and lung function and help the lungs expand, right, and stretch out. They boost blood flow, and most importantly, they excite the electrons in our molecule, in our molecules, to enhance the prana that's there.